Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. If you aren't familiar with my guest today, Kavin Senapathy, then I'm thrilled to introduce you to her and to her work. I hope you enjoy our conversation and hopefully learn something new to help you combat pseudoscience. And be sure to go to the show notes for some really great resources and links to more information on pseudoscience. I've got some blog posts, podcast episodes, not just mine, movies, and of course, my Sound Science Toolkit, which reminds me, I wanted to remind you that the Sound Science Toolkit is now an online tool. So it's no longer a downloadable PDF. So be sure to log in and check it out. And every time you log in to use it, you know that you'll be getting the most current updated version. I just added some really interesting information on false balance and some other great resources from Berkeley to the Sound Science Toolkit, including a series of 6 articles and posts on evaluating scientific messages. Now, with false balance, if you're not aware of that term, let me share a little bit with you. So the post that I'm sharing in the Sound Science Toolkit is called Beware of False Balance. Are the views of the scientific community accurately portrayed? Now, we know that balanced reporting is generally considered good journalism. And we need that balance. The public should be able to get information on all sides of an issue. But when it comes to science, we have to be careful because not always do all sides of the issue deserve equal weight. We need to weigh the evidence. So I was really excited to come across this information and to share it with you. So definitely go check that out. Now, I wanted to share also that I just got back from Michigan, where I did a full day media training with mock interviews. Thank you to the United Dairy Industry of Michigan for bringing me in. I got to meet about 20 dietitians and chefs and work with them all day, teaching them how to be compelling and some of those on-camera skills that are a little counterintuitive. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, and it was really great to meet some new dietitians, some who work in hospital settings, some who work with the Dairy Council, and just really help them kind of take their media skills to the next level. So speaking of media skills and messaging, I will be doing a messaging workshop, a 2-hour 2CEU messaging workshop at Today's Dietitian in Scottsdale. So if you're going to be there, check it out. The space is limited, so you have to actually apply to be considered and selected. And of course, we want as many people as we can fit into the room and to have an interactive session with. So check that out if you're going to be there. And as always, stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear some important updates from my partner, the American Association of Diabetes Educators. Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on the show, I delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today's episode is all about pseudoscience and how to detect it, how to understand the science better, and if you're a communicator, how to communicate it better. So we've got a great guest and some great resources for you today. Today, I want to introduce you to Kavin Senapathy. She is a speaker and a writer covering science, health, parenting, and the intersection of these topics. Her work appears in many, many media outlets, including Self Magazine, Forbes, SciShow, and many others. She's also a proud science mom to an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. She's the co-founder of SciMoms, whose goal is to advocate for science and evidence-based parenting. And she's the co-host for the Center for Inquiry's Point of Inquiry podcast. She loves to tackle the topic of pseudoscience. And you may have seen her in the movie Food Evolution. Welcome to the show, Kavin.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
So excited to dive into this conversation about pseudoscience. It's clearly a passion of yours. Now, I don't know much about your background and what brought you to where you are today and how you even got interested in science and health.
Right. I get that question a lot. And I've always been interested in science. I grew up with a scientist father. I've always been into it and found it fascinating. But honestly, I was pretty apathetic about these issues until I became a mom now 8 years ago. And I actually ended up with a case of postpartum OCD. So long story short, you can read about my experience online. I've written about it a couple times. But long story short, I had that kind of normal worry and fear that's so common, especially when someone has their first child, because, I mean, to everyone, you love this helpless thing so much, right? But and you want to do everything in your power to keep this child healthy and safe and happy. But with postpartum OCD, that's kind of blown out of proportion. So I was terrified and anxious and stressed, and I wasn't sleeping. And I was reading all kinds of information on the internet about everything that was purportedly going to hurt or poison my child. I was getting well-meaning advice everywhere from family members to the internet to Dr. Sears' The Baby Book. So I hit a wall, and I had to figure out what was true and what wasn't. And so I started that journey myself of learning how to kind of sift through these vast troves of misinformation on the internet, especially when it comes to parenting, and kind of separate the credible information from all of the not so credible information. And then a couple of years later, I started blogging for a site called Grounded Parents to kind of try to share this with other parents. And then that ballooned into a writing career over time, especially because there's so much in society that intersects with parenting, food, pharma, medicine, health, and even politics. So that's how it kind of all got started.
Okay, very interesting. Now, what did you study? What was your area of expertise?
I actually studied English literature in college. So I have done some coursework related to science and particularly genomics. However, most of my expertise comes from other people. I'm not an expert in any of what I write about, but I've kind of learned a lot about communication as I've done it for so many years. But yeah, I spend probably all day, every day, talking to experts in some way or the other on and off. So it's been a great experience.
And you always make that clear that you're not an expert, and that's kind of the point. So we're going to talk more about that. And I think it's a really interesting perspective that you bring to the table. Ironically, my daughter is studying English literature in college right now, and she loves to write. And so, I can see the writing aspect there. We need good writers.
Right.
So
well, there's so many misconceptions about English majors too, but that's a whole other episode.
Absolutely.
But yeah, good for your daughter.
Maybe you could talk to my husband about that.
Oh, okay.
No, she's going to be great no matter what she ultimately ends up doing. She might be a teacher. Who knows? We'll see. So I first met you on Twitter years ago, and then we finally met in person last fall at the World Umami Forum.
Oh gosh, that was so much fun.
Wasn't that a great forum? So I've since done a 3-part series on MSG and umami, interviewing several of the speakers and experts at that forum. And it was such a fun and thought-provoking journey to do the 3-part series with them. But it was funny because we were sitting at the same round table, and probably around lunchtime, I looked over and I was like, oh my God, I think that's Kavin. I looked at your name badge. I'm like, and I introduced myself. Yeah. I'm like, we finally get to meet in person. It was so fun.
Yeah, you tweeted me actually. You're like, you're here, I'm here.
And then turned out we were sitting next to each other.
Right. I was tweeting because, it's the World Umami Forum. It was, I think, the experience of a lifetime. It was, for the listeners who aren't aware of what this is, a company called Ajinomoto put on this forum. Ajinomoto actually was the first to come up with, they didn't come up with MSG, of course, because it's naturally occurring, but they were the first to isolate it. And they put on this whole forum about umami, and they combined all of the science with the cultural and societal aspects. And it was just so great.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Sometimes when I go to a conference and I see a great speaker, great topic. I will do a podcast episode. But with that, I said, I need to do more than one episode here. There's so much to talk about. Yeah. So that was fun. So yeah, I'm like tweeting you, hey, let's meet up. And turns out we're sitting next to each other. Gotta love it. So how did you get, I mean, obviously with parenting, science, health, food is a natural fit, but was there something in particular that got you more connected in the food and nutrition community and even connected with dietitians?
Yes. So it's kind of, to me at least, an interesting full circle kind of story. So I was blogging for Grounded Parents, and over the previous year or two, this was around 2013, 2014, I was hearing so much about GMOs. And if you take a look at Google Trends, which I just love Google Trends to just see people's search habits and how they change over time, the interest and the buzz about GMO was kind of spiking at that time, right? It was coming to a head. I remember right after my daughter was born, a family member, a close relative, asked me about GMOs, and they said, have you heard about these GMOs? And at the time, I didn't really know much. And she said, well, they take the gene from an unrelated species and they put it into a fruit or a vegetable. So, you could have a vegetable with a fish gene in it and you wouldn't even know. And if you or your child had a fish allergy, then you could have an allergic reaction. You wouldn't even know what was going on. And so I remember hearing that and kind of seeing all of this marketing stuff. And so I dove into the issue of GMO, which is hugely complex. For your listeners, GMO stands for genetically modified organism, and the definition varies depending on who you ask. But kind of the regulatory and policy level, GMO refers to any organism whose genome has been altered using modern molecular transgenic technology. But the interesting thing about GMO versus GE is that GMO almost represents for people and for consumers all of the fears that they have about the food system and all of the kind of ills of the food system, some of which are absolutely legitimate concerns, except pinning those concerns to genetic engineering kind of derails the whole conversation. But to answer your question, yes, it all started with the GMOs, and then there's so many other food issues, at least in people's minds, that intersect with GMO, that's how I started covering food in general and getting to know a lot of dietitians and farmers and people in the ag and food world.
Wonderful. And you have a great post on your SciMoms website that talks about what you were just saying with regard to GMO kind of being the, I don't want to say scapegoat, but we're not really talking about GMOs. We're talking about fear. We're talking about uncertainty. We're talking about the food industry, and it all just kind of, like you said, gets pinned on GMO. So I'll link to that in the show notes if anybody wants. It's a really great post, and I'll share all of your great resources and the website and social media handles and stuff we'll talk about later. But yeah, so I can see how that would be a compelling entree into the food and ag world. Now, I learned that you were once a fan of Dr. Oz, and that completely changed for you. So I want to hear this story.
Yeah. Oh, well, yes. So I think I myself, if I do say so myself, am an interesting case study when it comes to this stuff, right? Because just last year, I wrote a chapter in an MIT press book all about pseudoscience. It's called Pseudoscience. So I'm often turned to as a commentator when it comes to pseudoscience. But not long ago, I fell for a lot of it, right? So I loved Dr. Oz. Even as a child and a teenager, I loved just watching infomercials. And I would just completely be drawn in by the claims that were being made about all manner of products. But yes, not only was I a fan of Dr. Oz, but I purchased a couple of the supplements that he recommended, not only once, but like a few times. And now Dr. Oz, I think, is like one of the worst people on television. So it just goes to show that there are a few important tools or general guidelines in kind of learning how to evaluate information, not only on TV, but on the internet, which is a huge kind of wild west of misinformation, but that you can kind of change based on evidence and based on what you learn. So yeah, I did. I was a fan of Dr. Oz.
You kind of did a 180.
Yeah.
No shame in that. No shame in that. I mean, I think, I
Not at
talk
all.
a lot on the show about these celebrities and these very just compelling quote unquote experts. And it gets a little complex when you have somebody with real credentials that is at least overdoing the hype at a minimum.
Yes,
we'll say that he's really
best.
overdoing the hype. And I've talked on the show before. A good friend of mine who's been on the podcast a couple of times, Dr. Taylor Wallace, is now a regular on Dr. Oz. And we talked about it in the show. He has a PhD in food technology. Mm-hmm. And we need more credible science people at that table to kind of, okay, maybe the commercial says, oh, are these foods going to kill you? But then when you actually get to the segment, you have somebody sharing some real credible information. So we've got to have people everywhere to sort of level that playing field. But you were quoted in an article recently saying there are many solutions to being susceptible to pseudoscience, but it's complex. But one of the biggest missing pieces is that far too many people don't know the basics of evaluating the credibility of information on the internet. And that's where you've kind of rolled up your sleeves and figured it all out. And you're trying to help other people do the same. As a science communicator, can you share what you've learned, what you've seen? And, we're all consumers of information. My listeners are a mix of the general public and health professionals, but we all consume information. And some of us are also communicators, but can you share what you've learned over the years and, examples of things that might be helpful for people listening?
I don't have it all figured out, but it's always important to take a moment and separate yourself from your reaction to something, right? Say you get an email forwarded from your aunt, or someone shares something on Facebook that such and such substance that's present in so much of our food is actually known to cause XYZ ailment. I mean, that is scary to see something like that. But depending on if it's a blog post or a Facebook post, I encourage people to just kind of dig back a few steps to see the source of the claim being made and check whether that source is credible. Is it a peer-reviewed scientific paper? Is it the FDA, for example? Is it coming just from a blogger? I mean, there's this interesting example that I can think of that's pretty recent. And you might be familiar with this, of course, because you're in the dietitian world, but celery juice has become very, very, very popular as a claimed almost cure-all pure celery juice. And it's in all kinds of outlets. I've seen it on entertainment news channels. I've seen it on Goop, for example. But if you trace back all of these claims about celery juice, they don't come from scientific studies. It's not coming from experts. It's actually coming from this guy known as the medical medium. Have you heard of him?
Mm-mm.
So the medical medium, I should try to find him, but I'll just paraphrase because he has a lot of fascinating, kind of weird and implausible stuff on his website. But he is kind of a cross between a famous psychic and Gwyneth Paltrow. Mm-hmm. So he gets this health information from some kind of a higher being or supernatural being that's feeding it straight into his head because he's all powerful. And so he was told, among all this other stuff that he's been told, that celery juice is this powerful kind of undiscovered superfood that's going to cure and prevent all kinds of stuff. So that's just an example of digging to the source. And in this example, the source is a guy who thinks he's psychic, and he happens to be psychic, like just for nutrition. It's really interesting. But also, I think it's important to keep in mind that often you can get down to the facts and get down to the science and either confirm or debunk a claim that you've seen. But the reason that pseudoscience is so powerful in the hands of those who know how to exploit it, it's primarily because it can sound so credible. And sometimes the demarcation between pseudoscience and science isn't as kind of cut and dried or black and white as we would like to believe, because that would be so much easier, right? So there are some claims that we kind of just don't have an answer for to quite debunk, or there are some questions that are far more complex than we would like them to be. And that's especially true for food, right? There are a lot of fears that we're trying to allay with our behaviors and how we engage with food. Cancer is a big one. Of course, cancer is a very real threat for most of us. Like, we all know someone who's had cancer, or we've had it ourselves. Our family members have had it. But it's easy to want to say, well, I've heard that buying non-GMO foods can help me prevent cancer, but it's just not that simple. It makes us feel better, though, right? To avoid kind of an overarching scapegoat. So I wish I had this all figured out, but sometimes it's less clear than we want it to be. And sometimes we just have to learn how to be okay with that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've had a few guests on the show, some recent, some not so recent, that have talked about a lot of these types of issues. And on the show, I talk a lot about the limitations of food and nutrition research. We have a lot more epidemiological observational data than we do randomized control trials. There's just certain things that we can't do with people that we can do with animals, rats and so on. But you mentioned Goop, which is, of course, Gwyneth Paltrow, for those who don't know. And I did an interview with Tim Caulfield, episode 92, Celebrities, Pop Culture, and Pseudoscience, that people might be interested in checking that out. And his TV show, Cheating Death, has now been on Netflix for quite some time now. But when I did the interview with him, it wasn't available in the US yet. So that is, in fact, it was so funny because this morning my husband left me an article in the Chicago Tribune all about Goop and Gwyneth. And it's like, I haven't heard of this medical medium guy. Sometimes
you will.
Right. Well, I, like with the food babes of the world and stuff, I just like to live in my little bubble and not be exposed to that stuff. But it's important to know and see what's out there so that we can try to counterbalance it and keep fighting the good fight. But another guest that I had on recently, episode 108, Jason Reese, he talked about critical thinking and behavior change. And he does a lot of speaking, and he was on the panel at the World Umami Forum, Kavin, you might remember him.
Oh, right. Okay,
yeah.
Yes.
He is doing some really great work, and he talks about how we can improve our own critical thinking, as well as helping others improve their critical thinking, and also how we talk about these issues. And so I'm just going to kind of throw out some of the things that he mentions and see if you wanted to comment on any of these. But for one thing is people accept or use partial truths, or they accept or use false information. So we can help people by giving them the full picture, or helping realize, okay, this is not a credible source. Or then it gets a little hairier when, well, this is a credible source, but here's the limitations. There was a recent study that came out about eggs and cholesterol. I think the headline was very misleading. I can't remember what it was, but it was very disparaging. Eggs are going to kill you, basically. And when you looked at the limitations of the research, it really didn't connect with eggs at all. And they weren't even sure what the connection was between cholesterol and heart disease.
Yeah.
So it is complex. But also, we talk about causality, how correlation doesn't mean causation. And I think that's helpful for people to realize, I'm always using this example with my son, just because ice cream sales go up in the summer and drownings go up in the summer doesn't mean that ice cream is causing drownings. They both go up in the summer. It's that third factor, right? No, that'd be bad. And something that's been really powerful for me that I really feel is almost at the root of, or at least what I'm seeing in my world as a communicator, is helping people understand trade-offs. I interviewed Jack Bobo way back in episode 43, The Surprising Truth About Sustainable Agriculture. And he really does a great job of explaining trade-offs. And I think that can help people maybe gravitate a little farther away from that emotional gut feeling and not getting that black and white answer, and realizing that it's not absolutes. Or if you're looking at the environment and sustainability, you could be looking at one little thing, maybe it's the water, maybe it's the soil, but then there's the transportation and the fuel impact on the environment, just all the different things that we want to look at. Another thing is helping people understand their knowledge gaps. And I think there's two sides to this. There's the knowledge and then there's the emotions. So we can try to give people facts, and getting certain people to understand their knowledge gap is almost impossible because they think they know everything. But like you said, taking that step back and kind of looking at the bigger picture and going, well, maybe this isn't all there is to it. Maybe I can learn more. Maybe I have this knowledge gap and I want to get more facts, but then realizing that facts alone are not enough. So just wanted to share some of that.
Right. Well, I can comment on so much of that. In terms of headlines, that's totally true. And I think that's always been true to some degree with regard to the press. But the pace of how the press covers these things has, of course, gone up. And there's so many more outlets now because of the internet. And so there's this competition to try to cover things first. But also, unfortunately, for one, a lot of journalism has been outsourced to freelancers, and some newsrooms just don't have enough staff who regularly do a science-related beat. And so journalists are often relying on press releases right from the institutions or organizations or companies that are putting out information. But one recent example comes to mind, and this was last year. And it's not exactly food related, but it goes to how this kind of happens. But there was a story, and you may remember this, about how researchers had discovered a yet undiscovered new organ in the human body. And this new organ was called the interstitium. It's this fluid-filled space between all of our connective tissue throughout the body. And headlines, or many headlines and some articles reporting on this study, kept saying that this study, or this quote unquote new organ, can help explain how acupuncture works. And I looked at the study because I was skeptical right away, because acupuncture is by and large not evidence-based. And the study didn't even have the word acupuncture in it once, like not at all. Wow. And so I then wrote a story for Slate doing kind of a gentle debunk of this idea that could explain acupuncture. And it turns out, long story short, one of the lead authors in the paper has this great interest in kind of legitimizing alternative health and alternative medicine. He's like tight with Deepak Chopra, and turns out he was just telling reporters that this could explain acupuncture, and they just reported it. Mm-hmm. And the thing is also, we can't all be experts at everything, and we also can't all do an in-depth analysis about every single decision we make as consumers of food and consumers of really anything. And so there's got to be this give and take. Like you said, not only do we have to understand our gaps in knowledge, we also have to understand and make decisions all the time about if and when we are going to kind of do the research, quote unquote, ourselves, or whether we're going to rely on consensus when there is consensus about something. It's all very complex. And I don't remember all of the other points you mentioned, but it was all very interesting, of course.
Food for thought. Yeah. Jason Reese, like I said, he's doing some amazing work. Thank you for sharing that example. And when you were starting to say that the study found a new positive, it reminds me of, and this is years ago because I was still working in a hospital setting, just another example of sensationalized headlines. I was driving to work and I heard on the radio that they discovered a new vitamin or something. And I'm like, oh my God, this is groundbreaking. This is huge. Yeah. And then after the next commercial, they came back and they said, yeah, Betty Rubble is now a Flintstone vitamin. It's when they had created Betty Rubble as a vitamin. I'm like, oh my God. I was so like hooked. And then I'm like, oh really? Oh my gosh.
It's got to be a letdown as a dietitian to be like, what? And then,
yeah, I was ready for like the big news. Yeah. And I talk on the show a lot about how there are so many places in that process where things can sort of break down in communication, from the actual research study limitations to the press release that the institution puts out, the pressure to publish, all of those things. And as you know, Kavin, I created a free downloadable sound science toolkit that I really had dietitians in mind when I created it, but anybody can access it and utilize it. It's just a compilation of different resources that help people understand how research works, the different types of studies, the types of limitations, what confirmation bias is, correlation versus causation, risk versus hazard, and just things like that. So if anybody's interested, you can go over to soundbitesrd.com. There's a way to access it right on the homepage and on the sidebars of almost every page. You can sign up for that. And Kavin, I understand you've got a ton of great potential resources that I can add to it. So I'm really excited to catch up with you afterwards.
I'm really glad you shared this with me today because I have a few things that I would definitely like to recommend. But yeah, this is definitely looks like a useful and exciting resource. So I'm looking forward to digging in more. I was saying to you earlier offline, but I love that you have so much information about confirmation bias, how to evaluate a study, the different kinds of studies. But the first one that I saw when I went to your resource library was a resource on the science of science communication, which I think is so important because I think a lot of communicators or experts who do communication don't really know much about the science of communication or of science communication. And just one example of that is the knowledge deficit model or the information deficit model that suggests that if people have an incorrect worldview about something, we need to simply fill in the knowledge gaps and then they will magically change their mind, or not magically, they'll change their mind based on the information or the knowledge that the communicator fills in. But the science of communication shows that that's not really how people change their minds.
Right. And you had said earlier offline as well, and I thought this was really key, that trying to dig down to the source of your own question or concern. So it's not just looking into the facts and the science and what that shows, but, and this kind of ties into like your article on your website that I'm going to link to about, we're talking about GMOs, but we're not really talking about GMOs, is taking a step back and thinking, okay, what is my real concern? You know, what's eating at me? Like, what do I really need to address besides the facts?
Right. Well, especially because when it's something like GMO, it can be, as I said earlier, people's concerns vary wildly. But for example, if you talk to someone about GMO and they bring up the environment and sustainable farming or sustainable agriculture, that's a perfectly valid and crucial thing to talk about. So let's talk about that. And so that's kind of what I always try to do, as well as the other SciMoms.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask you, tell me about SciMoms. There's a movie that people can watch on your website. So tell me, I shared at the introduction what your goal and objectives are, but yeah, tell me a little bit about how you guys all met and decided to start this project.
Yeah, well, I have a smile on my face because whenever I think about the other SciMoms, I'm just happy. They're great women. So what happened was, well, this movie, The SciMoms, it's a short documentary available on YouTube. It's about 30 minutes long, and it follows me and 4 other moms in our quest to raise our children with science and evidence whenever possible. Of course, not everything falls within the purview of science and evidence, but to do that instead of relying on the fear and hype that's so common in the parenting world and has been forever, but especially kind of magnified because of the internet age. And so the other moms and I, Jenny Splitter, she's a great writer, and then 3 scientists, doctors Anastasia Bodnar, Leila Kadirai, and Allison Bernstein, we had all encountered one another on the internet over a couple years in our kind of adventures in communication and became friends. And long story short, Sarah Michelle Gellar came out against genetic engineering. And Layla and Allison are huge Buffy fans. So we were mad, right? So we wrote an open letter to celebrities about genetic engineering and about GMOs. The filmmaker, who's actually by profession an educator, she came across that letter approached us and asked if she could make a movie about us.
Wow.
And so she did. The movie, the SciMoms film, the goal is to give a voice to science-minded moms and kind of try and empower that community. People like you and me who sometimes kind of feel alone, on a playground of moms feeding their kids this and that, maybe foregoing a couple vaccines here and there. But the movie made a pretty good impact. And so SciMoms is a follow-on project of the SciMoms movie. And so what SciMoms does is just put out blogs, content, and even a comic strip and other, if I say so myself, pretty cool stuff, but also really informative to kind of just help put out that nuanced information that we think is so important in the parenting world.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Have you found, because this is what I tell people, especially in my media trainings, when I get questions from dietitians, other healthcare professionals saying, well, how do I combat this or that, misinformation? And of course, it depends. Sometimes you engage, sometimes you don't. But the number one thing you can do is to put out credible information constantly so that it's there when people go looking, sort of more of a proactive versus a reactive response. Have you found that to be at least personally fulfilling from that standpoint, and that you're not constantly, like Wonder Woman with the wrist reflectors,
the shields. Well, I do feel like that a lot. However, I think that we all find it fulfilling, and it's nice to hear from people, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or just in an email. Yes, allow me to encourage your listeners to, if you ever like or feel that you've benefited or learned from science-based information that you see anywhere, SciMoms or on Melissa's website. If you have the idea of sending a note of appreciation, please do it, because it's really appreciated and it keeps people going, I think, especially when we're talking about controversial topics. But yes, we hear from people who read various posts of ours saying that I was so worried about this ingredient or this additive or this product, and now I'm not so worried anymore, which I think is always great, because we have enough legitimate stuff to worry about as parents, and we are tired.
Absolutely. So people can go to, it's SciMoms.com, SciMoms.com, and get all of the information there. I also want to hear about, you were in the movie, the documentary Food Evolution. So I want to hear about how that experience was for you and what you can share with us about that.
So Food Evolution is a documentary. It's a movie that looks at genetic engineering from, I think, the nuanced standpoint that is so important. And I think of it as kind of like a time capsule in terms of my involvement in it. So back in 2015, I and my co-founders of an organization called March Against Myths, which is kind of on hiatus now. But at the time, we started as an activist group, and our first intention was to counter-protest a group called March Against Monsanto. And this group is not only anti-genetic engineering, but also anti-vaccine. Their thinking is kind of conspiracy theory thinking. And so we and other science activists around the country and even around the world decided to show up and counter-protest these marches. And so I showed up to the march in Chicago along with about 20 other people, and we counter-protested. Now, the filmmaker for Food Evolution found out that we were doing this counter-protest, and he sent a couple camera people, and they followed us for the whole day. So the footage of me and a couple of my colleagues in the film is of us at this counter protest. And let me tell you, the March Against Monsanto rallies at the time were quite a spectacle. We do think that we helped take some of the wind out of their sails. Their kind of on the streets action has really died down. But unfortunately, though, they still seem pretty active. However, they're active on the internet, kind of selling supplements and selling access to kind of alternative documentaries like the truth about vaccines, which is, of course, not the truth about vaccines. But yes, that was my involvement in that movie.
It was your film debut?
I think it was. Yeah.
Not even sure. That's funny. Well, I saw the movie and actually have pondered about getting the producer, Trace Sheehan, on the show. Not sure if that's going to happen, but yeah, I saw him speak at Today's Dietitian.
Oh, okay.
I think it was last year. Yeah. Would like to delve into some of the, well, why did you choose to open the movie this way? And, what has the response been and things like that. But have you gotten a good response from people about it?
I've been at a few screenings and a couple panels on it. So I think, and I've been there, it's really a great discussion starter. I think it's really difficult, almost impossible, to capture an entire issue in a film. But, there's, of course, a narrative there. But I think it has changed a lot of minds. That the director of the movie, Scott Hamilton Kennedy, he started doing, I think at the very first premiere in New York, he kind of would do an informal poll and ask audience members to raise their hands if they had concerns about GMOs before the movie and after. And I know the responses varied from screening to screening, but it seems to be maybe not necessarily changing a lot of minds, but getting a lot of people thinking. And so I think that's
key.
That's a good thing.
There are a lot of great experts interviewed on the show and a lot of great conversations. Definitely. Yeah. It's a good documentary. And, when we're inundated with all of the shockumentaries out there, at least we know that this one is evidence-based. And like you said, there's a narrative, there's a story. It's compelling. So I do encourage people to check it out if they haven't. So let's talk about your Center for Inquiry's podcast, The Point of Inquiry, where you are the co-host. Tell me, I know the show's been around for a long time, but you were more recently joined as a co-host. So I listened to a few episodes. I subscribed. Tell people what the show's about. I know you interview people, which is always fun. Maybe some of the interesting people that you've interviewed or shows that you would encourage people to go check out.
Sure. So Point of Inquiry has been around since 2005. Actually, it's the flagship podcast for the Center for Inquiry. And our mission at the Center for Inquiry is striving to foster a secular society based on reason, science, and humanist values. So it does strive to foster a secular society. I should say that I myself, personally, I'm a big fan of secularism, separation of church and state, but I have a lot of religious friends and family members. So I personally don't have anything against religion. But the podcast has talked to all kinds of guests. Kind of the overarching theme is critical thinking. My co-host is Jim Underdown, but for the most part, we do separate episodes. And people that I've interviewed so far, I actually interviewed several of the speakers at SciCon, which is the Committee for Skeptical Inquiries conference, and it's CFI's big annual conference in Las Vegas. I also spoke with Tim Caulfield. If anyone wants to check out something more recent, I think you did yours a couple years ago with Tim, as well as Adam Conover of the Netflix show Adam Ruins Everything. I would also, if anyone's heard of Jen Gunter, which I think a lot of people might have, she's known as Twitter's resident gynecologist, and she's often just out there debunking very well and often in a very entertaining and admirable way, I think, as a feminist, kind of just debunking medical misinformation on the internet. So those are two of the episodes that I would say listen to, but just, check out if any of the other guests spike some interest. And yes, please do subscribe.
Yeah. Subscribe, rate, and review, as they say. Yeah. I listened to several episodes, and the one in particular that really caught my attention with your co-host, it was about vaccinations, and it was really, it's always interesting conversation. Well, in wrapping up, what are some tips or insight or advice that you want to share when we see and hear stuff about food, nutrition, health, science on the internet, in the media? How do we take a step back and put it in your words? What can we do?
Sure. Well, I think if I had to just boil down my thoughts or advice for your particular audience, I would have one bit of advice for kind of two groups of people. So for people who encounter unsettling information about food, whether it be from a blog post or Dr. Oz, again, take a step back and try to find the source of the information and also try to look for the source of your concern and then go from there. It's a journey. And you know what? You can also hit me up on Twitter DMs. My DMs are open. So I'm good at connecting people with the information that may help them. And then the other group of people that I had in mind are people like the two of us, communicators or those otherwise passionate about combating misinformation, especially when it comes to science and food-related topics. That goes for anyone from podcast hosts to communicators to writers to scientists that are doing this communication to people that are just passionate about responding to misinformation on Facebook or online. Number one, I just commend anyone doing this work because it's really needed. However, I guess I would say go to Melissa's website and read this PLOS blog that's on your website about the science of science communication.
Oh, and the Sound Science Toolkit.
Right. Yeah. It's really important for us to understand that simply throwing citations or science-based information at someone with authentic concerns isn't necessarily going to work. I see a lot of ridicule on the internet that I think that, and I'm not saying that you're doing this or even anyone specific is doing this, but in general, I see this and I think it would be good to dial that back maybe about 20%.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Being confrontational is not helping move productive conversation forward.
Yeah. And I guess I would add, make sure that you know what a person's concern is. If someone brings up a concern, and I keep coming back to GMO because it's such an overarching example, a concern about GMOs, and you in turn throw them some safety data, sometimes it turns out that you're talking past each other, and that's not necessarily helpful.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I always tell my audiences when I do communications workshops that, being an effective communicator is more than just sharing good content and being comfortable in front of a microphone or in front of an audience. Yeah. We have to raise the bar. We've got to be compelling without being sensational. We have our work cut out for us against all these, celebrity quote unquote experts. So I commend you for all the work you're doing. And, I think the whole parenting aspect of it probably is a little wind beneath your wings. It's hard to get tired of fighting this good fight when it's really to make sure that your kids are happy and healthy and safe.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you do and for being on the show. I want all the listeners to check out SciMoms.com. If you're on Twitter, you've got to follow Kavin at K Senapathy, and that's KSENAPATHY. She's also on Instagram. And check out the Point of Inquiry podcast, subscribe, rate, and review. So thanks again, Kavin. It's been so great talking with you. And maybe next time we can do an episode in person.
Yes, that sounds awesome. Let's make it happen.
Since we're a couple hours away from each other, we should probably do that.
Right.
All right. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and not pseudoscience.
And a sprinkle of MSG.
Woohoo. Okay. Awesome. Sounds good. Till next time. Hey, everybody. Thanks again for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. As promised, I have some important updates from my partner, the American Association of Diabetes Educators. Ramadan starts on May 5th and runs through June 4th. And AADE has some tip sheets for educators and people with diabetes on fasting during Ramadan. You can find those at diabeteseducator.org/Ramadan. Also, the American Diabetes Association recently recommended that GLP-1 medications are a first line of treatment before insulin. There's a new section on the AADE website about GLP-1 medications. There's a fun animated video and some tip sheets that cover the importance of GLP-1s and how they can help people with diabetes better manage hyperglycemic events. These resources are available at diabeteseducator.org/GLP-1. And finally, there's a new practice paper focusing on the importance of community health workers in community engagement, extended program reach, and culturally appropriate individualized support and care, as well as how diabetes educators can incorporate community health workers into their program and practice. The link to that paper is at diabeteseducator.org/CHW. And remember, AADE 19 is in Houston, Texas in August, so if you haven't registered yet, I hope you do so soon. Thanks again for listening to these updates. I'll see you next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.